Of all the many attempts at creating a console mascot for Sony's PlayStation, few could stand on par with that of the purple scaly hero that is Spyro the Dragon. This little fireball immediately took off with young gamers everywhere, and became an instant staple in the PS1's library. The characters were imaginative, the worlds were fantastical, and the story was simple enough that anyone can jump in and begin playing without memorizing a million made-up words and concepts. You were just a little winged guy with an attitude, torching menacing creatures and innocent sheep alike, rescuing your friends and family from a very rigid fate. The staff behind the iconic franchise, an American developer named Insomniac Games, is known today for creating interesting set design and integrating intuitive mechanics within their projects. These guys' art direction is vivid, and one might even say magical, even to this day. Many of their projects involve a fantasy element of some kind, whether it's immense urban landscapes, trans-dimensional portals to interstellar planets, or dreamlike getaways into lush mythic environments. Their work across the years has a constant level of quality, and you're never left disappointed in imagining what could have been. And while the worlds of Spyro may seem like typical whimsical fantasy, it was actually a struggle for the staff to come up with the new mechanics, levels, and characters from each entry in their original trilogy. Insomniac Games' first ever video game was a first-person shooter named Disruptor, often described as a Doom clone by players and even some of Insomniac's staff themselves. Disruptor alternates between fast-paced gunplay with flashy graphics and new-to-the-industry live-action cutscenes. During its development, Insomniac ran into several hiccups involving publishing and financial backing, getting denied by nearly every publisher they sent prototypes out to. All of them, that is, except for one. In 1995, Insomniac was picked up for support by Universal Interactive Studios, who decided to take a chance on the promise presented by their founding developers, Ted Price and Alex Hastings. With this incredible boost provided by Universal, the team was able to pull their game out of the gutter and complete production by the end of 1996. While this game was praised critically, Disruptor failed to get the public recognition that it needed to become a financial success. Most of the additional money spent on the game was done towards development costs, less so an advertisement budget. On top of that, the target audience for the PlayStation had shifted from adults who had disposable income to being a family product that more kids and teens could interact with. So Insomniac took the lessons learned from the production of Disruptor and headed in a new family-friendly direction. Enter Spyro the Dragon, the fun-loving, tail-kicking, feisty flamethrower. Originally pitched to be an interactive love letter to the 1996 movie Dragonheart, the concept of the game shifted pretty early in development from a dark fantasy action game to a light-hearted collectathon platformer. A few executives at Universal also heavily pushed Insomniac to develop a title that would help break into a shrinking demographic pool of the PlayStation. At the time, among the handful of at-home video game console developers, Sony considered Nintendo to be its biggest competitor, and rightly so. A vast majority of Nintendo's titles for its N64 were targeted towards children, with then popular games like Super Mario 64, Donkey Kong Country, and Banjo-Kazooie dominating the market. In an attempt to ramp up broader appeal, Sony approached several of its publishers with a new mandate, urging them to help break into this untapped potential. As such, Insomniac's game was given many iterations, but eventually settled in for something new and creative. The lead programmer for the game, Alex Hastings, designed an original game engine to help cover the added mobility necessary to design around a character with wings. This engine would display far-off objects with low poly textures, but as the player drew closer, it would begin to add more detail until they were at their complete state. This process would also work in reverse, de-rendering objects that the player wasn't looking at or made some distance from. While incredibly complex for the limited processing power of the original PlayStation, once the engine was built, the level designers and character modelers got to work on filling out the world with unique assets. The character of Spyro himself went through several iterations during development as well. According to Peter Hastings, Alex's brother, the original idea for the protagonist was supposed to be a large green dragon named Pete. Pete would travel to other worlds ruled by dragons, fighting enemies and saving mythical creatures. However, before they got too far in with this narrative, it was brought to their attention that Insomniac may face future copyright issues with their character, as a Disney film from 1997 titled Pete's Dragon would likely get in the way. They were also worried after concept art was made for the game, with several staff noting that it would be difficult to differentiate the dragon from the many landscapes that comprised mainly of fields of grass and trees that they were planning to create for the levels. While the dragon character from the movie wasn't actually named Pete, the concerns were big enough for Insomniac to scrap their protagonist entirely and begin anew. They redesigned the dragon, aging him down significantly, colored him with a vibrant purple that would help him stand out, and reworked the name. The staff settled on Spyro after attempting to find a way to add some fun to the term pyro, the Greek word for fire. To help bring Spyro to life, Insomniac hired veteran voice actor Carlos Alaraski, known for his work as Rocco from Rocco's Modern Life, Denzel Crocker from The Fairly Odd Parents, and this strange talking chihuahua from those Taco Bell commercials from 1997.
Yo quiero Taco Bell.
Also, something of note is that the first 3 games in the franchise were composed and produced by the former drummer for The Police, a British rock band that grew popular in the 1970s. Stuart Copeland was given early builds of the game to playtest and to get a feel for the worlds created by Insomniac. As he completed levels, using cheat codes and getting assistance from Insomniac developers, he would create the skeletons for themes and polish them later in studio. More recently, in April of 2022, Copeland released project files of music from the 3 original games on streaming services for all to listen and appreciate. Spyro the Dragon released in North America on September 9th, 1998, to positive acclaim across the board. Game Rankings gave it an aggregate score of 85 out of 100, citing the open level design as a major draw and complimenting the art design. IGN gave the game a 9 out of 10, with Craig Harris saying he had as much fun with it as his first time playing Crash Bandicoot in his review. Video game magazine Edge gave the game a 7 out of 10, going so far as to call the game, quote, the best 3D platform game for the PlayStation, but were disappointed in the lack of an additional ability kit like that in Super Mario 64. Next Generation Video Game Magazine gave the game a 4 out of 5 star ranking, and GameSpot gave it an 8.3 out of 10. Indeed, fans and critics everywhere raved for Spyro the Dragon. The game was praised for its presentation and art direction, with many compliments being tacked on to the originality of the worlds and characters, and the in-game environment's level of detail. Many took note of the render distance functionality provided by Hastings programming, and this technology would be used much later in other games with open world maps. Copeland's soundtrack was also a smash hit, being noted as atmospheric and catchy. It was reported that sales were were slow to start upon release, but once the holiday season was in full swing, they picked up dramatically, selling over 1 million copies by December of 1999. Development for a sequel began shortly after release, with an additional focus being laid down on difficulty. Much of the original game's criticism was on how easy it was to actually play the game, with barely any challenge being added by the later portions of the game. So the goal this time around was to provide a varied experience by creating multiple objectives within a level, new skills for the player to unlock, and harder boss enemies as you proceed through the game. Their extra effort seemed to have paid off, as the sequel, Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, released in November of 1999 to similar acclaim to the first game. Critics praised the art direction and use of new technology, as well as the added mechanics to enhance the gameplay. Insomniac seemed to be on a roll, sparking great joy in just 2 years with a brand new IP, and striking up a friendly rivalry with other development studios at this time, like that of Naughty Dog and Sony Computer Entertainment itself. They rode this hype train so hard, the Mad Lads actually managed to bust out another sequel in less than a year, dropping Spyro Year of the Dragon on October 10th, 2000 to even better acclaim from players and critics alike. By this time, the technological limits of the PlayStation had all but been explored. Most titles that came out pushed the machine to its limits, and developers began looking to the horizon for further possibilities. Sony had been teasing new hardware for release, with the PlayStation 2 having already released in Japan in March and was scheduled to drop on October 26th in America. With this newly introduced potential, and having confidently made 3 successful video games within 3 years, Insomniac expressed interest in becoming a self-sustaining studio that could develop and publish its own video games. Universal Interactive was more than happy to let the studio go, however, they were adamant about one thing in particular. Any intellectual properties that Insomniac had created while using them for publishing were solely owned by Universal, and Insomniac couldn't take them with them. After a bitter realization, but clinging more so to their original ideals as a video game development studio, Insomniac successfully parted with Universal in 2000 and went on to create the incredibly lauded Ratchet & Clank franchise. Spyro, however, stayed with Universal, and was soon thrust into a roller coaster of unfortunate circumstances. After their publishing contract with Sony expired in April of 2000, the label was reorganized, with the video game publishing outfit being rebranded as Havas Interactive. The following year, the company announced plans to bring a new Spyro game to the PS2, Xbox, and PC, hiring 2 new studios, Equinox Digital Entertainment and Check 6 Studios, to produce the game. This, ladies and gentlemen, marks the beginning of one heck of a journey for our purple pal here. Because while his takeoff into video game history may have cleared pretty easily, for a while into the 2000s, Spyro had difficulty maintaining his legacy as a staple franchise. Most of the fanbase looks to the follow-up to Spyro 3, titled Enter the Dragonfly, as the beginning of his downfall, and for many reasons that I will go over in this video, they tend to have it right. It's obvious from the beginning that this game just didn't receive the same love and care that the original trilogy did during its development. Many of what made those games mechanically impressive and artistically passionate are, at the very least, lacking incredibly, or at worst, completely absent here. On top of being split between 2 different development studios, with Equinox being responsible for the game's graphics and art direction, and Check 6 in charge of actually designing and creating the game, the staff within each studio was pulled in multiple directions thanks to the constant involvement and interference from their publisher. Enter the Dragonfly has a surprising amount of creativity trying trying desperately to be heard through the cacophony of technical issues and design oversights, but even this isn't enough to save it from what would ultimately end up in the final product. I hope you're ready, everyone, because today we're going to go over everything, from the actual development of the game to what ended up actually being printed and shipped to retail outlets around the world, and hopefully by the end I will have explained why I think Spyro the Dragon has a bad sequel. Official development for Enter the Dragon began in early 2002 and was handled by two companies working in tandem to produce the game. Check 6 Studios was formed in 1997, named for the original 6 co-founders. After setting up the company, many of the staff members worked separately from one another, helping out in production for other games by other companies. It wasn't until they were approached by Universal in 2001 that they got their big break, getting contracted to produce 2 Spyro titles back to back. To help them with their debut project, they were to work in collaboration with Equinox Digital Entertainment, another development studio that offered additional support to larger studios working on their games. Equinox had a history as far back as MechWarrior 2 in 1996, so their track record was steady and the two got to work immediately. Together they formed a basic concept demo, trying to come up with a theme to pitch to Universal. Noticeably at this pitch meeting was a man named Joel Goodsell, who had recently worked on several Disney interactive projects for the previous console generation. He immediately signed on to the project and worked as a design lead for this next game. Goodsell attempted to push a more mature tone onto the project in the beginning, going so far as to recreate the demo he had been shown, but with darker material in the art and assets. Universal dismissed this idea quickly, insisting on maintaining the family-friendly themes as the original trilogy had in an attempt to withhold their audience. After a few iterations, trying to find a happy medium between the old content and a new aesthetic, Goodsell was able to, sell Universal on a pitch based on a quote epic Zelda-esque RPG light that incorporated a hub-like base with an open world around it that changed seasons over time. After getting their publisher to sign off on it, production for Enter the Dragonfly began in full in February 2002, being confirmed for PlayStation and GameCube releases. Though, from the get-go, problems arose seemingly around every corner. For one, the engine that was developed by Alex Hastings for the original trilogy didn't translate at all for the PS2. This meant that Check 6 had to develop an entirely new software engine for the game to run on, which proved to be a challenge in and of itself. While the stages were designed to be larger than any that had come before, the levels were completely rendered at the same time, with no variance in texture quality dependent on the player's distance. There was a noticeable pop-in whenever the player approached other NPCs, enemies, and even gems, but levels were loaded completely upon traveling to them. The original plan for the game structure was to create 25 levels, each with larger stages, more mini-games, and map traversal. Due to these problems, the game was reduced in scope heavily, ending up with a paltry 8 levels instead. The majority of Enter the Dragonfly's development woes came from a common issue back in early game design during this time, and that was simply having too many cooks in the kitchen at the same time. Not only was the staff from Check 6 working on this game, but they were also receiving assets and art from Equinox, who frequently butted heads with the narrative writers and 3D modelers. On top of that, executives from Universal Interactive, the publisher contracting the game in the first place, were constantly at odds with the leads and directors of the game as well. Goodcell was often at odds with Saji Johnson, a senior designer from Check 6, and Risi Rukavina, a creative director from Universal. A toxic cycle of going behind each other's backs to change things, both inconsequential and fundamental about the game, soon began to fester, to the point where it was dragging out development on singular levels and even concept art. According to a design document made public in 2020, the staff were forced to cut about a dozen levels from the final product simply because they couldn't keep the pieces together long enough. With the project not getting enough time to be put together properly, and with an overwhelming number of highly paid executives on staff at the same time, Check 6 eventually started to run out of money shortly after the halfway point in production. Staff were talked into spending additional unpaid hours working on the game, to the point where some programmers and artists slept at their offices to avoid the time it took to go home and come back in the next day. Goodcell eventually left the project due to these constraints, worried about the well-being of the staff and their financial standings, but also growing weary from the infighting of the development staff. It would all prove to be for naught, however, as the stress continued to pile on for the project. Universal was adamant about being able to get this product on store shelves before the end of 2002. Insomniac was capable of pumping out these games every year, and it seemed to have imbued the publisher with false expectations. As such, they pushed Check 6 and Equinox to have the game finished before the holiday season. This sudden crackdown, on top of their already strung out staff, made the final months of work on Enter the Dragonfly incredibly harrowing. Despite the 2-year development timeline, several concepts and assets were scrapped entirely. The game was originally supposed to have reappearances of previous allies and enemies from the first 3 Spyro games. And while there are some remnants in the final product, like the appearance of Spyro's companion from Avalar, Hunter, a vast majority of these were repurposed or just straight up abandoned. Upon release, review outlets and players everywhere made very vocal complaints about the game. Many believed that they had been deceived in the final product about having been told about many massive levels available, when in reality there were less than 10. The game suffers from plummeting frame rates, longer than standard loading times, sound effects and musical issues, and an overwhelming number of graphical and mechanical bugs. In line with Universal's many mandates for the appearance of the game, Enter the Dragonfly plays almost exactly like the original trilogy, specifically Year of the Dragon, with its additional skills and movement controls. Spyro can be moved in any direction with the left analog stick, and can actually alter the camera angle with the right one now. In previous iterations, the camera would automatically snap to Spyro's backside when the player moved. You could pan the camera with each shoulder button, but it wasn't until recently when you could move it to look at whatever you wanted. However, at any point when the player is standing still, there's also a button dedicated to pulling the camera in close and letting the player scan the area in front of them. This was also used to aim projectiles in first person, but this seems to happen less frequently in Enter the Dragonfly. To traverse the levels, the player can make Spyro jump, and by pressing the jump button a second time, they can glide over certain distances to help cross gaps and access new places, and even find hidden areas of interest. To combat the various enemies sprinkled throughout each stage, Spyro is capable of either colliding directly with his foes, or by using a flame breath to singe them. The charge attack will actually thrust the player forward quickly, acting acting as a pseudo-sprint mechanic as well to traverse areas faster. Additionally, the added skills from Ripto's Rage and Year of the Dragon were implemented here as well, allowing the player to use a head bash maneuver to break objects below them that couldn't be broken with charging in flames, and the ability to climb up ladders and ledges, as well as swimming within clear waters. The main gameplay mechanics that separates Enter the Dragonfly from its predecessors is the addition of new breath elements. The goal of this game is to search the new dragon realms for scattered dragonflies. However, they don't just submit when you find them. Dragonflies found in the wild will flee, and you must capture them to bring them home. In order to do this, the player is given a new breath element, Bubble Breath. Also added later are Electric Breath and Frost Breath, which deal damage with lightning and ice respectively. The player can switch through elements with a shoulder button, rotating through options on the fly. Each element has their application in the game's level design. Bubble Breath is designed almost exclusively for catching dragonflies. Electric Breath is used to power machinery, as well as pierce certain enemies' armor. Frost Breath can be used to encase foes and friends alike in a cube of ice, either subduing them or turning them vulnerable, as well as the potential to make them into a block for traversal. And of course, the traditional Flame Breath, which not only damages foes, but also melts frozen blocks and other ice-powered enemies. There's also a mid-game power-up called the Wing Shield, which very specifically reflects certain enemy attacks and nullifies damage. The issue with Enter the Dragonfly's main gameplay loop is twofold. Firstly, everything still feels very samey. Like, of course there were going to be some semblance of the older gameplay here, being a sequel to the original trilogy. But the issue arises when you hold the levels and its gameplay routine up directly to the originals. While the levels themselves are massive compared to previous games, having an extra few rooms and plenty of terrain to navigate in each part, the worlds themselves feel like rehashed versions of places we've already been on Spyro's journey. For instance, the Dragon Dojo is a retextured bamboo terrace from Spyro 3. Crop Circle Country is just Robotica Farms and Metropolis from Spyro 2 mashed together. Cloud 9 is just Cloud Spires with Sleepy Bears instead of, whatever the heck these things were. Monkey Monastery is Colossus, Thieves' Den is Haunted Tomb, Jurassic Jungle is Magma Cone. The only levels I could say that have some kind of originality is Luau Island and Honey Marsh, though the exact same tiki statue enemies from Idle Springs reappear in Luau Island for some reason. So while being within the worlds themselves is entertaining, nothing really feels new or innovative. Even the speedways, these mini-game breaks that challenge the player's dexterity and agility, function exactly the same way as in previous games. The only thing is this time, they've subtracted functions from them instead, taking out the hidden hunter mini-games that you could play after you cleared the time trial and race modes. Despite these thematic issues, the level design itself is actually pretty great, giving players multiple opportunities to double back and find alternate routes through the expanded terrain. There are still plenty of places where the player is encouraged to take advantage of Spyro's glide mechanic, not just to cross extended gaps to progress forward through the goal, but also to find additional side objectives and hidden dragonflies to collect. Something the original trilogy nailed that I personally appreciated was these neat little alcoves that contained a secret treasure, or a collectible of some kind that's used to open a gateway or a chest in another part of the level. These were often reached by ascending to a really tall part of the map and gliding halfway back across it, landing in a cave or making it over a wall of some kind. Enter the Dragonfly has this in a few places, but it's mainly just used for backtracking to find a hidden stash of gems, or even a one-up butterfly for sparks to crunch down on. Hidden areas were rare, but what was even more rare were places the player could climb up on top of and used to access a chunk of the map. The first game specifically has lots of these moments where a mountaintop or a cliffside could be used to reach just about the rest of the level, likely as a way to show off the procedural rendering engine, as even Spyro 2 and 3 didn't do this as much, but in Enter the Dragonfly, things felt especially linear. The only stages I could say with confidence that actually felt open and accessible were Monkey Monastery and Cloud 9. For a series based on being able to fly and feel free, this game just felt particularly chained down. The narrative in Enter the Dragonfly, or should I say the lack of one, was also a major sticking point for many players. Without much exposition, or even letting us know how much time has transpired, the game just jumps right into a new adventure, featuring characters from both Ripto's Rage and Year of the Dragon. The game opens by panning onto a series of balloon characters, which for some reason includes the Sorceress, the villain of the Forgotten Realms, who tried to devastate the dragon population by kidnapping and killing the hatchlings for their wings? And we're celebrating that? So then the next thing that happens is, holy jump scare, Batman! Damn! This game is so ugly. Like, you could tell that 6th generation console hardware had not been out for very long. In an attempt to make the characters more expressive, they added many scenes where the characters themselves are flexing their face muscles and body parts. But because they're supposed to be cartoon characters, it comes off more like some disturbing hallucination sequence. Hunter and Ripto especially have this gross habit of just unhinging their whole jaw and flapping their gums until you see directly into their abyssal souls. Oh yeah, speaking of which, somehow Ripto has safely survived his bath in molten lava from Spyro 2, and not only traveled out of Avalar as a whole, but somehow managed to make it into the Dragon Realms to antagonize Spyro. So he literally shows up directly in front of these guys, with both Gulp and Crush by his side, and ugh. Guys, this is literally making me sick to look at. Like, the way his entire being just jiggles and contorts is so... man. Yeah, I'm done. We're moving on from this. Ripto arrives and spews out his threat, that he's here to capture all the dragonflies before they could be partnered with a dragon, thus eliminating the dragon's ability to use magic. He unleashes a spell meant to absorb them all into his new scepter, but screws it up so badly that it scatters all the gathered dragonflies all over the realms before taking off into a sparkling portal in the ground. Bianca takes Spyro and they run off to start gathering dragonflies. They reunite with Sparks, and Bianca gives him the ability to use bubble breath in order to catch them, and sends him on his way, whereafter the player is introduced to the main gameplay loop. Spyro is given the task to journey through the new Dragon Realms, searching every nook and cranny for the scattered dragonflies. He'll visit a training facility for dragonflies called the Dragonfly Dojo, an enormous farming compound called Crop Circle Country, a deadly vacation getaway destination named Luau Island, a land of dreams and slumber called Cloud 9, an ancient destination for inner peace named Monkey Monastery, a bumblebee farm thriving in a murky bog called Honey Marsh, a massive cave hideout for pillagers and crooks named Thieves' Den, a scientist's laboratory gone haywire called Jurassic Jungle, and the new volcanic dominion of Ripto's Lair. After a few levels, gathering gems and discovering the hiding places of many dragonflies, the player will get a peek into Ripto's lair to see what exactly he's cooking up. And honestly, it's really a big fat ol' nothing burger. The scene given to us kind of plays as if we're supposed to see it right after the opening one. Ripto and his cronies come out of the other side of their portal, with Ripto lamenting that he lost the dragonflies he was supposed to capture. Crush and Gulp were actually given voice lines for this game for some reason. They sound exactly how you think they were gonna sound too, with really ugly, stereotypical, all brawn, no brain, droll voices. Especially Gulp, the poor guy.
What do you want this time, Ripto?
Yeah. What do we want this time, boss?
Ripto blasts them for even trying to question him before laughing way too hard at his own maniacal vision. After that, there isn't any more cutscenes for the rest of the game. You heard that right. Not another single scene until the very end of the game. There are sequences where the player will interact with the NPCs to get the lowdown of the stage, but in reality, that's about it. The last cutscene of the game takes place after Spyro whips Ripto's butt once again. After getting bombarded with the different breath techniques and transforming into a monstrous form, Ripto breaks his own scepter and then yeets himself into a gateway. Afterwards, Spyro and the gang resume the festivities that they were having earlier in the game, celebrating the Dragonfly assignment ceremony. Hunter is concerned that things may not be good to go, but Spyro then breaks the fourth wall by looking directly at the player and winking before the fade to black and credit roll. The thing about Enter the Dragonfly's story is that it's just incredibly undercooked. The entire narrative is given to us over a mere 3 distinct cutscenes: a beginning part 2, and the ending. Between each of these, there's just no connective tissue. Each stage has a simple theme of Ripto's minions are here screwing things up, Spyro needs to help us, and that's it. Spyro as a franchise hasn't been dependent on cutscenes and exposition, with the exception of the reboot trilogy, but I'm not talking about those games yet. The point is, you could be dropped into a game that was episodic in nature due to the games being designed around traveling through portals to different worlds. They were paced really well, and never went too hard in trying to create a dramatic story with thrilling consequences. You were just a purple dragon taking on some evildoer with vile intentions. It was short and simple, and made it both easy to follow and provide memorable characters. Enter the Dragonfly just doesn't have any of that. It hardly has anything resembling a story in the first place. The player is dropped into a scenario and is just given time to complete it, going from A to B, and then skipping everything else until the letter Z. There could be many reasons for this, but the most obvious one is probably the insanely rushed development with the argumentative staff behind the scenes. Right up until the final moments of production, a through line for the game's plot was established, but certain characters were taken out and then put back in. Worlds and locations were just swapped, and some of them were even just straight up deleted. It all made for one heck of a mess, and unfortunately for us, it reflected in an awfully incompetent storyline. When Enter the Dragonfly released to the public, it immediately was met with harsh criticism and derogatory marks from review outlets and players alike. It received a 48 out of 100 from Metacritic, with most people pointing out the boring, samey gameplay from previous titles, on top of the constant stuttering frame rate and graphical bugs. IGN gave the game a 6 out of 10 for similar reasons. Douglas Perry says in his review, quote, "Enter the Dragonfly is essentially a replica game, a sidestep or a lateral move rather than a pace forward. GameSpot gave the game as low as a 2.8 out of 10, giving it perhaps the harshest review by pointing out the game's short length, abundance of game-breaking bugs, and terrible story pacing. Even Ted Price, the founder and now president of Insomniac Games, hammered on the game and its production, saying, quote, "Spyro has become an abused stepchild. Enter the Dragonfly on PS2 and GameCube was an absolute travesty. While we don't know exact sales numbers for the game, the PS2 version did eventually make it to Sony's greatest hits label, indicating it sold at least 400,000 units in North America, and in the UK, it obtained the Platinum Sales Award from the Entertainment and Leisure Software Publishers Association, which has a threshold of 300,000 units sold. The massive negative reception to Enter the Dragonfly spelled disaster for Check 6 Studios and Equinox Digital Entertainment. Check 6's only finished project since its founding had been Spyro, and thus they didn't have a financial backup plan in case of failure. In fact, because the studio had no resources post-launch, they had no development revenue for the second game that they were contractually obligated to by Universal, and were forced to cancel the project. Because they shut down before making the games they were supposed to, they had to pay massive legal fees for breaking their agreements. With all of the failures and financial burdens, Check 6 was unable to pay out its employees for the last few weeks of Spyro's development, and also several severance packages, with an estimated $200,000 in debt still owed to those people after the company was liquidated and closed its doors. Equinox would go on to suffer a similar fate, being forced to close its doors after not retaining enough financial stability to begin new projects for and with other companies. Several people working for Universal that were associated with Enter the Dragonfly were also let go, and in March of 2007, a lawsuit was filed against the publisher, the developers, and even Sony themselves when a child suffered epileptic seizures after playing the game. The plaintiffs actually won out in this lawsuit, getting the child's recovery and further treatment covered by the remaining corporations, Vivendi and Sony Computer Entertainment America. Enter the Dragonfly would be the final game developed in this style until much later in 2018, when the reignited trilogy was released. Spyro as a franchise is one that's always been very special to me. My three big mascot platformers for the original PlayStation were Crash Bandicoot, Rayman, and Spyro the Dragon. This original trilogy captivated me, and the fantasy lore stacked with interesting exploration mechanics made it the perfect game to pass the time and get invested in. There was always such amazement and wonder when I played these games. Spyro was an instant hit with me and my brother, as he had just the right balance of moody angst and heroic justice. He stood out from the crowd as a dragon you could rely on, as he smiled and had fun causing mischief and kicking butt. The smooth as butter gameplay, running around and torching foes, and exploring vast open-ended levels was fun, and you never wanted to stop playing. Every time you hit a milestone in the narrative, you were treated to entertaining encounters with your enemies and curious interactions with your friends. These games taking place in mythical worlds was a huge advantage, as it allowed the developers to innovate and really stretch their imaginations across all different kinds of lore and storytelling to bring something captivating together in the end. This trilogy was satisfying by the time you completed them because you got a whole picture, and the entire thing was enjoyable, and you got your time's investment out of it with the amount of bonus content and unlockables you got for finding everything you were supposed to. You could easily pour hours of your time into these games and get a complete experience out of them. Enter the Dragonfly, on the other hand, spits in the face of all of that, whether deliberately or not. The game shipped in such an incomplete state, it's a wonder the thing functions as much as it does. There's an abhorrent amount of glitches in this game, with some game-ending consequences. Not once, but twice, I managed to inadvertently soft-lock myself trying to talk to NPCs to finish quests. The first time was in Crop Circle Country, talking to a farmer after I cleared the level. The second time was in Jurassic Jungle after I finished the lava walking mission. During my time on Cloud 9, I managed to spend enough time in the overworld that the background music finished entirely and just stopped replaying from its loop point, making the second half of the level there completely silent, save for the effects of enemies and Spyro himself. Some voice lines when speaking to NPCs in general were just outright missing, or didn't play after I talked to them again. During the Thieves' Den level, there are these giant swinging green axes that you have to dodge as you jump along. The hitboxes on these things are obnoxious, and I got caught multiple times on them even after they'd swung past. The experience here was just so bland. Sure, it was the same old Spyro gameplay, which I am definitely fond of, but it was executed in such a poor way that the game as a whole was ruined because of it, souring a legacy that was carefully crafted to be entertaining, whimsical, and memorable. Enter the Dragonfly is just none of those things, with perhaps the exception of being memorable enough because of just how bad of a game, even more so a canonical sequel, it truly is. That's gonna do it for me today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate each and every single one of you. As always, if you liked what you saw here, consider giving this video a like and hit the subscribe button for more content from the Northeast's biggest nerdy stuff lover. Remember to stay awesome, and be kind and rewind. Have a wonderful night. Excelsior.